He's the CEO of What Doctors Don't Tell You and the Get Well Show. But there's another side to Bryan Hubbard, a side that began with 10 years of depression from a childhood trauma. In his search for a cure, he came up with an amazing, groundbreaking, and very radical theory about how the past invades you like an unwanted guest. And from there developed a system of overcoming it that helped him overcome his own depression. He's here to tell you all about it and to talk about how his Timelight program can help you get over trauma from the past. Please welcome my husband, Bryan Hubbard.
Hello, everyone. If you suffered from an unhappy childhood, you're much more likely to suffer from a chronic disease as an adult. Now, this seems extremely strange why that should be, but the facts are there. There's been several studies into this. For instance, you're 4 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. You're 3 times more likely to get heart disease, and you're 3 times more likely to suffer respiratory disease. Now, although this is sort of recognized by psychiatry to an extent, it's been investigated a few times now, and the phenomenon has been seen in many studies. No one quite understands what's going on. It doesn't sort of make sense why this is happening. I mean, we see it in more common ways in terms of people whose parents maybe denigrated them or didn't encourage them. They sort of lack confidence as an adult. We see this all the time. But the idea that it also causes chronic health problems is something else. Now, it seems there is a process going on here that psychiatry is not recognizing at the moment. And it's something that I've been exploring myself, and I think I've come up with one explanation for why this is happening. And I want to get onto that in a minute. But let me first of all go back to the seriousness of this, because it is serious. It's not being recognized by medicine at the moment. And I think it's absolutely essential that we begin to understand this process. In other studies, they found that children who suffered 6 or more adverse experiences, now I'll come back to that term in a minute, but they use the term, it's generally accepted, ACE is known, adverse childhood experience. So when they had 6 or more of this, they died 20 years earlier than other people who had fewer adverse experiences as children. And another study found that kids who suffered great social and stressful adversity, as they called it, throughout their childhood were up to 4 times more likely to die prematurely. I mean, this really is life and death stuff. And yet again, people are not recognizing this. And it's indeed, researchers were astonished by the results they came up with. And so it really is something that doctors do need to begin to understand. But understanding it is one thing, but really we do need to also say, well, how do we treat this? Now, as I mentioned earlier, they use this expression, adverse childhood experience, or ACE, which is it's a general set of experiences that are generally used in psychology to understand what's going on with kids. And in all, there are 18 of them, and I'd like to read them out to you. And maybe as I do so, if you could make maybe a mental note if you feel that this is something that relates to you or something that you've experienced. And I will say that we've done this in workshops, we've read these out, and it's quite extraordinary how many hands go up with many of these adverse experiences. And it does make for shocking observing that so many people have had such terrible childhoods, and what a terrible job that parents have made of parenting. And it really is quite astonishing how common this is. So I'd like to read them out to you one by one, and I'd like you to, as I say, mentally note, yes, that applies to me. and then we'll take it from there. So number one in the list of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is a parent swore at or insulted the child. If that has ever happened to you when you were children, if you remember that happening to you as a child, just make a mental note of that. A parent swore at or insulted the child. Number two, a parent acted in a way that made the child fear he or she might be physically harmed. Okay, you feel threatened, you felt scared that something violent, physically violent, might happen to you. Number three, a parent often slapped, pushed, or grabbed the child. Here in the case now where physical violence has occurred, you were slapped, pushed, or grabbed as a child. Now, what I should say here straight away is that this does not necessarily have to be repeat behavior. Indeed, it just seems to be one incident seems to be sufficient for it to merit as an ACE, as an adverse childhood experience. Number four, a parent often hit a child so hard that there were marks or injuries. So you were marked or injured in some way from the hit. Number five, a parent touched or fondled the child. Number six, a parent wanted the child to touch them in a sexual way. Number seven, a parent attempted some form of sexual intercourse with the child. I should say again, this is getting into sort of deep, murky waters, but and again, the number of times the hands are going up here is quite extraordinary. A parent attempted some form of sexual intercourse with the child. That's number seven. Number eight, a parent succeeded in having sexual intercourse with the child. Number nine, a parent had a drink or substance abuse problem. So they could be alcoholic or near alcoholic, or maybe they were taking street drugs of some description. In this one is number 10, a parent used street drugs. Number 11, a parent was depressed or mentally ill. Number 12, a parent attempted suicide. 13, the mother was sometimes pushed or grabbed. So the violence here was against the mother, not against the child, but nonetheless created an atmosphere of violence in the family home. The mother was kicked, bitten, or hit with a fist, presumably by the husband. The mother was repeatedly hit, so this was just a constant backdrop to family life. Number 16, the mother was threatened with a knife or gun. Number 17, a parent went to prison. And the final one, 18, the parents were separated or divorced. Well, of course, I'm sure that's true in many cases. Now let's go back to what we were saying. So that's the 18 adverse experiences that are recognized by psychologists as having effects on you as an adult. Let's go back and remind ourselves. So if you had 3 or more adverse experiences as a child, you remember those 18 we just read out, you had 3 of those, you're 4 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, you're 3 times more likely to get heart disease, and you're 3 times more likely to suffer respiratory disease. Then if you remember, you said that if you had 6 or more of these adverse reactions, then it is a desperately unhappy childhood if you did, but you're going to die on average 20 years sooner than someone who had fewer than those 6. And then the other one said that you're also 4 times more likely to die prematurely. And this is extraordinary, isn't it? That this is happening to people, has happened to people. And there's no explanation for it. Well, why should this be? Why should it be that a father who shouts at you when you're 4 years of age affects what happens to you as an adult? So much so, it doesn't just mean you're less confident. It can also mean that you are suffering chronic health problems, that you could die sooner than someone who had a happier childhood. Okay, so my name is Bryan Hubbard, and I want to explore this with you today. Um, like so many people, I suffered from chronic depression for about 10 years, and I couldn't understand what was going on with me. I had suffered an unhappy childhood, but I hadn't made that association. It hadn't occurred to me that anything that happened to me as a child was going to affect me as an adult. And I think few people who go through an unhappy childhood do make that connection. We just think, well, for one thing, I think you just sort of think, well, that's how life must be. And that's how it must be for everyone. That's how kids are brought up, because you've got no comparison to make. So there we were, by the age of 30, suffering from depression, which was really quite ruining my life, although outwardly it would appear I had no reason to be depressed. I had a good job, married, happily married, and 2 wonderful children. And so why was I suffering from this? And I think I was sort of determined to find out. And I couldn't really accept the standard definition of depression. I certainly couldn't understand or accept the idea of a chemical imbalance in the brain, which has now been discredited as a reason for depression. And really, psychiatric profession doesn't really know to this day what depression is and what causes it. So I was rather at a loss. I didn't know quite what to do to find out why I was so depressed. As I say, bearing in mind at that time I hadn't made the connection to an unhappy childhood. Then a few things happened to me in my life which sort of helped piece things together. The first was visiting my own father. And the day I visited him, he was in bed. I mean, he was a very healthy man. I mean, he was okay. He was at this point 90, but he was a very healthy man, and he'd had medical checkups just a few years earlier, and they had said he had the heart of someone 20 years younger, and he seemed to be physically in reasonable shape. But there he was in bed, and I just asked him, well, what's wrong? And he just said, I feel like I've had enough. And I sort of turned to my mum, and she's always just going through a funny phase, and he often did go through funny phases, but there you are. He went through a funny phase there, and we thought, oh, well, no more of it. That was the Sunday. The following Wednesday, the phone rang. It was my mother, and she announced my father had died. And it sort of got me thinking that he sort of had given up, and that he'd decided he didn't want to live any longer. And I didn't know, and talking to people, it's not that uncommon. You do hear people saying, well, yeah, my parents all gave up too. They felt they'd lived enough and they didn't want to live any longer. And it's not on the death certificate. It doesn't say it had enough. It doesn't appear as a reason for death. But it does happen, and people do say that they've had enough. So anyway, that happened. Then a few years later, it sort of started falling into place one afternoon. And it started by me reading a book about ghosts. And it was, I don't know why to this day, why I picked it off the shelf, but I did. And it wasn't a subject that had particularly appealed to me or interested me, and it doesn't particularly appeal to me now. But anyway, so I pulled this book off the shelf. It was written by a Canadian academic called Ian Stevenson. And it was very thoroughly researched. It was good science. What he did was he went around the world interviewing people who claimed to have had visitations of ghosts. And the stories were very similar in almost every case. It was a case often of a relative or close friend visiting these people, but with a message. And could be anything from, oh, you'll find the missing will in such and such a place, or whatever. I suppose the funniest story was about an old sea captain who said, I can't rest in my grave because my wooden leg was not included in my coffin Somehow he was separated from his wooden leg. And so the ghost of the sea captain visited these people and said, "You'll find my legs in such and such a place." Then they dug it up, and there it was. And with the permission of the graveyard, they added it to his coffin, and the ghostly visitations ended. And so you had funny stories like this, you had interesting stories, you had intriguing stories. But I think what was most common throughout all these was they were very authentic stories, and invariably it was told by people who didn't want to tell it. They were either embarrassed or thought it was socially awkward or whatever to tell this story to Stevenson, but they were assured it was medical research, and so in that name they told the story. But it was a common theme that ran throughout, and I think it was the idea of unfinished business was essentially the single most common theme of this. And then suddenly it sort of tied in with what my father had gone through. He'd had enough. And yet somehow there was this life that carried on because it was unfinished business. And then suddenly this extraordinary expression popped into my head, and I still to this day don't know where it came from and what it meant. But it was that to which you do not fully attend shall weigh you down. That to which you do not fully attend shall weigh you down. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if you don't have a full experience of something at that moment, you'll carry it with you. So, for example, if you don't forgive someone in that moment, if you don't fully understand why someone has said or done what they've done, and so therefore you finish with it, if you don't do that, you'll carry it with you. Is that the energy of that will stay with you. It could be the resentment, the anger, the upset, the hurt will stay with you. And then it suddenly all made sense to me. I suddenly realized that time was an energy, and that more to the point, time was created by an energy of past experience. And it was this that explained my depression. It sort of also explains everything else. It explains why, if you've had these adverse experiences, you will suffer from chronic health problems, and you may even die prematurely. And the model I created, which I called, by the way, Time Light, is simply this. There are 3 time zones. There is present time, past time, and there's potential. Now, present time is probably the easiest to understand because we're doing it right now. If you're focusing on the screen and listening to what I'm saying, you're present, therefore you're present time. But everything falls within present time. Everything around you is present time. But if you, for example, looking at the screen and then you suddenly thought, why did that person say that to me yesterday? Well, now you're in past time. You're not present with me any longer. And the past dominates the present, and I become secondary to that focus. Similarly, if you would say, well, sort of interesting, but I wonder what I should have for dinner tonight. Well, again, you're not present. It's the future. And when people are suffering from depression, chronic health problems, they become more past than present. And this is the process that you have to recognize and understand in order to free yourself from it. Now, explaining the time sequences a bit more for you. As I say, with present time, it's relatively self-explanatory. Past is made up of 3 types of memory. There is the narrative past, which is essentially the story of who you are. So that's my name, my upbringing, my religion. And these are memories. It's a memory that I was brought up a Christian, that I was born in such and such a place, that my name is this. But it's a memory, really. I remember my name. So that's one form of memory. The other one is knowledge. I remember how to do things. I remember how to tie my shoelace. I remember where I parked the car. I remember where the car keys are, or whatever it is. But all of this is also memory is a past action, which helps us to function and navigate through the world. Nonetheless, these are past memories. But the most important element of the past is the psychological past. And this is the one where you only partially experience something, where there's some hurt or resentment left over. There's something that lives on in you. And I think that's the single most important thing to understand, that it lives on in you. And it is this energy of the past that creates your present. Now, how do you know it's happening? Well, we've seen already that if you do suffer from some problem, whether it's depression, anxiety, or if you are suffering from chronic health problem, I think it's something that needs to be investigated. Is a possible reason why you're suffering from that thing. But it appears in many, many different ways. I mean, another very typical way that the past will influence and change the present is when, for example, there are repeat patterns in life. So, for example, if you are constantly choosing the wrong partner, if you have money problems, business problems, whatever it might be, but if you keep on, I mean, it can happen to anyone, but if it keeps on happening, you should suspect that there's a past element there which is repeating itself. And then there's the potential center. The potential is one center that is outside of space and time. And bizarre as that sounds, you yourself have had many, many experiences of this, even if you haven't quite recognized it. We all have. And it can be from the more esoteric, like ESP, where you are outside of space, through to seeing the future. And we often do this in dreams. It's quite interesting. A researcher in the 1920s called J.W. Dunn did a whole experiment with about 300 people, taught them how to remember their dream. And in about 30% of cases, they were seeing the future. They were predicting the future in their dreams. So that was a sequence that happened outside of time. And there are many, many examples of this, which I don't have time to go into now, unfortunately, but there is this potential that is part of who you are. Now, one of the key things to understand is that we live with the idea that there is some central controller who is this constant, rational, decision-making I, this I called Bryan, or whatever your name is. And it's an illusion. And the truth is that often we are thought into being by the past. And this past actually controls and creates an I that then owns the problem. Now, that sounds complicated, and actually it's not. Let's, for example, say that you suffered one of these adverse reactions, childhood experiences when you're a kid, and it's caused you to become depressed. This happened in my case. Now, what happens is that, imagine it was saying, look, it was this experience that happened to you, which you didn't fully understand. This created an energy, a body of energy in you, which has not gone away. This then influences and changes your present. So the whole thing you have to see is as an energy system. Everything is energy. So this energy of the past is creating this present for you. But here's the real key to this. It then creates an I that then announces, I am depressed. Now, when I am depressed, I need help. But in seeking the help, it is an extension of the depression, not of the person who is depressed. Do you get that? So the energy of a past experience creates a pattern or problem, health problem in the present, which you then own. There's an identification with that, which says, I am depressed. So what happens? I, who am depressed, or I, who have maybe anger issues, whatever it might be, then seeks therapy and help. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but until you understand what is actually going on, that in fact this I who is owning this problem isn't even the problem, is only an extension of the problem and doesn't exist separately from the problem, then and only then can you actually start to reverse the problem, if that makes sense. It takes a little while to assimilate, because we're so used to the idea that there is this I who then has a number of things. I am a person who tends to get angry. I'm the sort of guy who's jealous. I'm the sort of person who, whatever. I control and do that. But maybe if you can see it's the other way around, that the thing itself then creates the I, which owns the problem. One of the koans in one of my books is the thought thinks the thinker. I mean, we're all brought up to believe that we think thoughts, but thoughts come first. The sequence is energy, which is from an ACE, an adverse childhood experience that you've not fully recognized and understood. Energy will then create emotion, and into the brain will create thoughts. So it's the thought creates the thinker, because once you've had the thought, it requires someone who thought, and that is creates an individual, a thing, a subject who thinks. It all sounds a bit complicated, I know. It's hard to explain all this in such a short session as this. But I hope it's sort of you interested to say, so you see what it does is sort of get you off the hook a bit. Because if you're not depressed, but there is depression, it creates a space between this subject of depression, and depression itself. And when that is created, you've created space between you and the problem. Then there is a real chance of reversing that. Now, I laid all this out in a book I wrote a little while ago called The Untrue Story of You. And it's been picked up by many people. We've had a lot of success. We've run workshops. We have people who really have major breakthroughs with this book. It's also now been picked up by a clinic in Germany who are starting to experiment and play around with these ideas with their more difficult patients who they haven't had any breakthroughs with, to see if it can help them as well. And I think it could help you. And I run you through a little bit more of this in more detail, try to explain all this, because it takes a while to sort of bed in, because it is, as the philosophers say, sort of counterintuitive. So, yeah, it takes a while to bed in. But if you would come over to the website and give us your email details, then we can start this process in more detail. Because, we don't have to live like this. We don't deserve to have this sort of life. We don't deserve to live a life of depression or anxiety. We don't have to have a life of chronic health problems. That's not how life is supposed to be. And I don't really think it's what a life your parents wanted you to have. But they could do no better than they did. And understanding that is one step towards, I suppose, recovery, to reverse these problems. And you deserve to do that. And we all deserve to have a happy, fulfilling, and creative life that is fully present. That's what we're here for. And in that, we can spread that to others, rather than spreading the misery of our childhood onto our children. And I think that was one of my early wake-up calls as well. But when I became a parent, I was aware enough at that point to know, I'm not going to live my life like that and be a parent like that to my children. I knew that much is something I wasn't prepared to do. And you're not. It's not meant to be like that at all. And I don't think you should want to live like that any longer. It's time to end this. It's time to step out into the sunshine, into full present, and enjoy and embrace life. But you can only do that when you are fully present. If you have more past than present, then you are past. You're not present at all. And the other danger is, through psychological time, what does the past do? If it's in misery, it wants to create happiness, but happiness is bypassed in the present to some future point. So you'll create something like, you'll see that I want to have X to be happy, or whatever it might be. And this is a transmission of psychological time, which creates this time sequence from past to future. But if you notice, it bypasses the present, because no one seems to know how to be happy now, but I know how to be happy tomorrow, if and only this happens. So it's conditional on me getting the Mercedes, the bigger car, the new job, the pay rise, or whatever it might be. But of course, you're not going to be happy. It might give you some temporary relief and you feel happy for a couple of weeks, and then you'll go back into your old ways again. And that inevitably will happen until you understand these processes. So I'd invite you to come and join me in this, to understand more fully these processes that are going on in you right now, because you deserve to do this. You deserve this for yourself. So I'd invite you to come to my website at some point, just sign up, and we can begin that work together. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.